Thank you, Marcus. And yes, I'm Emma Parry. I'm a partner from McKinsey's London office, and I also co-lead our carbon management service line, which includes carbon removals. It's a great pleasure for me to be here amongst so many carbon dioxide removal enthusiasts. And I want to thank Climeworks for bringing us all together, but also for inviting me to speak. Thank you. I'm going to base most of my remarks today on a report that we released at the back end of last year, the beginning of this, all about carbon removals and how to scale a new gigaton industry. Obviously, we know there are a lot of reports published on the carbon removal industry, not least the great State of CDR report, the second of which was released by Steve Smith's team yesterday. So we wanted to try and bring a particular angle to it so that we could be complementary to what's been published so far. So we tried to bring a bit more of a business perspective. We looked at three things. First of all, we looked at the economic potential for a carbon removals industry at a net zero compliant scale. We also looked at what we thought it would take for industry actors to move to create an industry of that scale. And we looked at what might be the first mover advantages for those that did go first. And it's this last point that I want to really dwell on today, because I think it's really significant. Because the question of why now for CDR or why now for carbon removals is one that comes up quite a lot. When I'm talking to my clients or when I'm talking to organizations and companies at events like this, or more commonly at events which have got nothing to do with carbon removals, the question of why do I need to worry about carbon removals now is a common one. The question sometimes goes like, well, I've got to worry about decarbonizing my operations. I have to worry about decarbonizing my supply chain. I have to worry about how I'm going to grow my business in the face of economic volatility. Surely carbon removals can wait. And the answer that I usually give is, yes, you absolutely need to ensure your company can grow and thrive in what are quite difficult macroeconomic conditions. Absolutely, you need to decarbonize your operations and your supply chain because, as we all know, that's the bulk of the path to net zero. But I wouldn't leave looking at carbon removal too late because there are advantages to going a bit earlier. Of course, we are all interested in the carbon removal industry, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So we hear the announcements that come with kind of heartwarming frequency, whether it's Microsoft announcing a record-breaking deal with Stockholm Exergy, or the US Department of Energy releasing its phase 1 winners of its CDR purchase pilot, including, of course, Climeworks. And all of these announcements give us a sense of a vibrant industry that's coming into being, which of course it is, and that's great. But I suspect we're all also realistic enough to know that even the most significant announcements are really just a drop in the bucket compared to what is needed. I'm not going to try and school you on IPCC figures. We all know them really well. 6 to 10 gigatons in 2050 if we're to be on a pathway to 1.5. And because we know this industry, we know that it can't wait to 2050. We have to start now because we need the time to put the installed capacity on the ground. We need the time to make the technology ready. We need the time to mature the commercial models, to recruit people with the right skills, to build supply chains. We also need carbon removals now because climate change is happening now. So based on the climatic need alone, we don't need convincing. But I think this is quite an interesting picture because what we looked at here was what is the projected installed capacity of carbon removal out to 2030 if we look at what's been publicly announced today by players who are active in the market. And how does that compare to where we would need to be if we were to be on a trajectory to meet that gigaton scale that the IPCC says that we need? Well, as you can see, we're 3 to 10 times off, which is quite significant. So maybe we don't need convincing that the time for carbon removals is now, but somebody somewhere out there does need convincing that carbon removals is a problem for today and not just for tomorrow. So how do we convince them? Well, the good news is that carbon removal doesn't lack economic potential. We looked at what the economic potential for a carbon removal industry might be, and what we found was, even today, the current market size of carbon removal could be between 1 and 2 billion per year. If we look at all those projected announcements for a pipeline of installed capacity, by 2030, it could be between 40 and 80 billion per year. And then if we look at the gigaton scale that the IPCC is talking about, we could be talking about an industry that is $1 trillion per year in value. That's really significant. And of course, the sooner we scale, the sooner we can see that economic benefit. So maybe that could be one of the reasons why now. Of course, I know and you know that it's not so simple. And one of the big challenges, of course, is costs and prices. I'm sure you hear this a lot, and we hear it too. Costs and prices are very high, and they need to come down if the industry is to be affordable at the sort of scales that we need, particularly for the sorts of industries that will need carbon removal on a large scale. And of course, there are researchers and innovators working all over the world to try and do that, creating new methods for carbon removal and iterating existing methods, both looking at the science and also looking at the engineering of the balance of plant to try and make things more efficient. And we hear often this $100 per ton number that people all seem to be using as a bit of a target. Our rule of thumb is that each generation of technology should come down 50% in cost each time you do an iteration. And Climeworks' third-generation technology is a great example of a company trying to do exactly that. The other good news is that just by scaling, particularly for technology-based removals, the costs should fall as companies learn how to do it better and as supply chains get more efficient and as risks are better understood, better mitigated, and therefore more keenly priced. Our analysis suggested that by 2035, the costs of technology-based removals could have fallen by 30 to 60% through this learning effect. Meanwhile, for nature-based removals, the cost might increase by 20 to 60% as scarce resources, such as land, become more scarce. Of course, 2035 depends on how quickly the industry scales. If the industry scales faster, maybe the costs will fall more quickly. If the industry scales slower, well, the reverse might also be true. So potentially there, another reason to get on with it, so that we can get the costs down to the affordable levels that we know that we need. So in our view, what needs to happen in order to scale a carbon removal industry to the gigaton volumes that we need? What do industry players need? First of all, let's talk about buyers. Our sense is that buyers need credit for their actions now. Buyers need incentives to buy. I think we all intuitively understand that. And whilst eventually that incentive might be the strongest incentive of all, a compliance incentive, in the meantime, while the market is voluntary, proper recognition for a voluntary commitment to CDR now could go a long way to stimulating short-term demand. So stronger buyer incentives for actions taken now. The second point is all about transparency of standards and practices and services. And honestly, much has been written and said on the importance of transparency and standards in the carbon removals market as it develops. And it's absolutely essential, and I won't do it justice by trying to summarize it all here. But I think it's suffice to say that if we don't get this part right, then we won't build a market in which participants and stakeholders have confidence, particularly against the backdrop of some of the rest of the problems in the rest of the voluntary carbon market that we see. I also want to make another point here, which is we need to make it easier for new participants to get involved in the carbon removal industry. We need to make it easy for them to understand what they're buying, for them to be able to value what they're buying, and for them to be able to trade it with ease, particularly if we want to go beyond the converted and those that have deep enough pockets to put big teams against a topic like carbon removal, because most companies simply can't and won't. Sending a clear public sector signal. So government support is critical, and I know that policy is a topic that will be discussed later this afternoon as well. And we've seen, and this can come in a variety of different forms, and we've seen a number of different actions by governments already, whether it's the USA and its Inflation Reduction Act, or whether closer to home, Switzerland's commitments and its NDC, or closer to my home, the UK government looking at how to bring carbon removal into its ETS. Government support will be really important for carbon removal, just as it has been from many nascent industries at this stage in their development. And whilst all of the things that I've mentioned and all the things I haven't mentioned are very welcome from governments, the State of CDR report yesterday was really clear that there's still quite a significant, what they call CDR gap, remaining between what governments are committing and what's required. Costs and prices, we've talked about that already. They have to fall in order for the industry to become affordable. And they need to do that in a way which is sustainable for an industry which is still growing, where many of the earlier participants are still taking significant risks. Also, contracts need to be designed so that buyers who act now can still take advantage of the costs falling, so that they feel confident to catch the falling knife now, rather than wait until the costs are really at rock bottom. And then finally, it's an obvious point to make, but suppliers need to be able to grow. And in order to be able to grow, they need buyers to buy, they need investors to invest, they need lenders to lend, they need supply chain partners, they need skilled workers, they need permits from governments, they need a whole ecosystem of partners who are ready to act, all of whom need a good answer to why now for CDR. So beyond the climatic need, beyond the economic potential, and beyond the need to get on with reducing costs and prices now, why now? Well, for governments, I think it's about economic growth. As we've seen in the USA, supporting the CDR industry spurs innovation, it results in infrastructure build, which is good for economic development, it grows skills and jobs in highly productive sectors like engineering, and it attracts inward investment as well as unlocking domestic investment. Governments are looking for pathways to growth, and the CDR industry could be one. For suppliers, it's obvious, but I would challenge all the suppliers out there to be as bold as they possibly can be to make the most of the early mover advantage and secure true competitive advantage in so doing, whether that's locking up demand or whether that's getting your foot on essential resources, natural or supply chain related, that will be essential for you to grow. The carbon removal industry is still in its infancy. There's all to play for, and even those that are ahead can't afford to be complacent. For investors, I think it rests on the economic case. If you believe this is going to be a trillion-dollar industry in a couple of short decades, then positioning yourself early could be very valuable, and learning the industry deeply before the crowd arrives could pay off. Now, of course, not all investors can play this long game, but for those that can, it could be really invaluable indeed. Marketplaces, again, it's sort of obvious that they would want to move quickly, but the question I have here is, what's the industry structure going to be like in the long term? Is this going to be a winner-takes-all industry, where network effects create incredibly strong barriers to entry? Better get on with it quickly, rather than wait and find out. And then lastly, buyers, which the industry needs so badly. The answer here for me is it's about securing potentially scarce supply of a commodity that most organizations are going to need, either to fulfill their voluntary commitments or their compliance commitments later down the line. We've already seen that the build pipeline is 3 to 10 times short of the climatic need based on what's been announced so far. We've also done an analysis that looks at if all the companies that have made net zero commitments or commitments to carbon removals were to require removals in 2030, how does the balance of supply and demand look then? It's still short. And if there is no offtake, even some of those announced projects will not be built. So for me, I would say to buyers, this is not a supply chain problem that you can afford to put off. This is a supply chain question to secure a commodity, a credit that you need now, that needs looking at today rather than tomorrow. So I'm convinced. Hope you're convinced. McKinsey institutionally is convinced as well. What are we doing? Well, we're serving clients, and we're serving buyers, we're serving suppliers, we're serving investors, we're serving marketplaces. We're also conducting industry research, which we hope helps to move the debate along. And we're trying to convene the ecosystem, although I don't think we've ever convened this many people on CDR before, in order to try and forge interesting connections that will help the industry. And then finally, we're purchasing credits. So we've committed to a 2050 SBTI-aligned net zero. We've also committed to 100% removals by 2030. And in 2023, we already had 50% of our carbon credit portfolio in removals, through a mix of long-term CDR offtake agreements and other methods. And this comes alongside the SAF deals that we're also doing. And we're funding this with a $50 per ton carbon fee, which also has the benefit of incentivizing decarbonization investments around our global network. The time for CDR is now. We're all early movers, otherwise we wouldn't be in this room. So I know none of you needed convincing today, but I hope I've given you some points that can help you with the challenge I'm going to set you now. My question to you is, who will you encourage to be the next early mover? And my challenge is, I'm going to see a bunch of you all again, probably some of you in a couple of weeks, some of you maybe in a few months, some of you maybe I'll see next year. And the challenge I set you is, how many new early movers are you going to convince and bring along for the next time we meet? Thanks for listening. I'm Emma Parry. It's been lovely to speak to you today.